Welcome to FinOps in Action. I'm your host, Alon Arvatz. Each week, I'll sit down with FinOps experts to explore the toughest challenges between FinOps and engineering. This show is brought to you by Point 5, empowering teams to optimize cloud costs with deep detection and remediation tools that drive action. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm really excited and delighted to host a dear friend. He's an IT professional with over 30 years of experience with designing and implementing IT infrastructures. He led large-scale projects, including, listen to this, the complete rebuild of a 17th-floor corporate headquarters, transforming it into a cutting-edge technology hub. We should talk about it. He holds multiple AWS certifications and was selected for the AWS Community Builders Program in 2021. Today, he's the Infrastructure Architecture Director at Dolby Laboratories, and he's responsible for FinOps. Please welcome Mike Graff.
Hi, good day, everybody. Good to meet you all. Thanks for having me, Elon. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for joining us, Mike. And Mike, let's go straight to business. What do you think should be the FinOps practitioner's top priority today?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. I think, there are three things I think to be successful as a FinOps practitioner. One is kind of having those technical skills, right, to be able to understand and interact with engineers on their architectures and to be able to understand what they're building. And then, on the flip side, you need to have those business skills, right, to be able to understand where finance is coming from, right? FinOps is kind of this interesting juxtaposition of engineering people and finance people. And so I think you need to have those skills as well. And most importantly, communications skills. I think this is something that is so often missing in IT people in general, right? I've always viewed this as my secret sauce, as my ability to communicate effectively. And so being able to explain those technical concepts to people who are non-technical in a kind of a understandable way is really important. And then again, being able to go the other direction and be able to communicate those business requirements or business needs back to your technical stakeholders is equally important.
Interesting. So let's try to break it down for a second, Mike. You started with talking about the importance of understanding the technology. Now, you're a FinOps industry veteran. Like you've been in this for, I don't know how many years, you'll tell me in a second. I feel like there is a shift where people understand how important it is to understand the technology. So traditionally, there was a lot of finance people doing FinOps. And today, these finance people understand they need to understand better the technology. So I wonder if you see the same trend because you've been in the industry for a while. And two, how would you recommend to a person who want to do now this shift to take your advice and understand technology to get a deeper understanding of the technology so we can do his FinOps role very effectively?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I kind of come at it from the other direction, right? I started as a technologist and as an engineer and not really as a finance person, right? So I'm kind of coming at it from the other direction. And when you go to these FinOps conferences like FinOps X or other events, it's kind of this interesting mix, like I said, of like you've got the pure engineers and you've got the people who are, accountants essentially, right? And so having them kind of come together and see who can drink more is kind of an interesting part of the conference. And let me tell you, the finance people really can muscle it down pretty well. But I'd say, I do think that there is more desire from the people on the finance side to really understand technology and to be able to communicate effectively with engineers. I know that in my own role, as we've done more in the cloud, I've had to spend a lot of time kind of educating finance people on the concepts of cloud computing, if you will, right? Because it's a totally different model from your traditional IT procurement cycle. And so getting people to understand how cloud works and how you're paying for it is a big challenge. So I think, for your pure finance people, getting those kind of free classes on, cloud fundamentals, like the cloud, there's courses for like cloud for finance professionals, is what I usually point people towards to give them that kind of at least the foundational vocabulary so that we can have a conversation.
Interesting. And also, as a person that comes from a technical background, so you've done multiple AWS certifications. Is that something one that you will recommend to more finance people? And would you recommend it also to engineers that already work with cloud, have an understanding of the cloud, to take these certifications to deepen their knowledge?
I think yes. Certifications are always a tricky thing, right? If you're somebody who's been working in the field for a long time and you already know this, there may not necessarily be a lot of benefit to getting a certification unless you're working in a role where that's kind of required. Like if you're working for a VAR or something like that, where they need to have those certified people on staff. Um, for me, it's about deepening my knowledge and getting a broader um, understanding of services that maybe I wouldn't be working with on a day-to-day basis. So that's why I pursued certifications. For finance people, I do think something like the basic like cloud practitioner certification, if you're talking about AWS, would be a useful thing to have. Again, just to kind of get that common vocabulary, if you will, so that when you're having these conversations, we're speaking the same language.
Got it. And let's go to the other point you mentioned about actually doing this communication between the engineering and the business side. Actually, we talk about a lot about communicating with engineers on this podcast. You also mentioned communicating to the business. And I wonder, how do you do this effectively? How do you take like technology and communicate it to the business in an effective way?
Yeah, so like I said, that for me, that's I think one of my secret weapons, and it's basically comes from my background. So my background is not in technology, or my education is not in technology. I actually have an English degree, right? So being able to effectively write and sentences is something that some of my friends in IT aren't always great at, right? So I'm not telling people to go back and get an English degree, but kind of being able to communicate effectively and distill these highly technical concepts down to something that a business person can understand is just it's so valuable, right? To be able to to make yourself more valuable to your employer or to your role is having that ability to just communicate and distill down technical concepts to a non-technical audience. I don't know that I have a secret way to figure out how to do that, but that's just something that I'd say is a muscle you need to develop if you want to be highly effective.
Of course. And who do you communicate to on the business side at Dolby today?
So, I mean, it's all over the place. So I'll be talking with engineers in the trenches building stuff, and then I'll be making business cases to senior executives on how to move forward on something, right? So, um, like when I was trying to get the FinOps program off the ground at Dolby, that was something where I had to be able to articulate the benefit to senior executives who were going to be funding the program, right? It's one thing, you and me, we're engineers, we understand that saving money is important and that we should definitely be doing this. But, making that business case for how if we spend, this amount of money, we're going to be able to go out and capture all these savings that are out there, and making that kind of business argument and the total cost of ownership and the return on investment that you get from launching a program like that.
Cool. And can you maybe break it down a bit for us? Like how you build the business case? What were the different parts of the business case that actually made it possible?
So we started with kind of understanding what the universe of potential savings were that was out there, right? Because that's the kind of the sizzle that you're going to be able to sell it to the business. Like, look at all this money we could be saving. So that started with using tooling like Point Five, for example, to gather that information and make the case for, okay, there's this is the universe of savings that are available. And for me, from there, what I did is I actually whittled it down to, okay, what's realistic, right? We all know that talking to engineers and getting them to take action is a regular challenge with FinOps. And so you have to be kind of realistic. There might be, $100,000 worth of savings, let's just say, as an example, but maybe only $60,000 of it is reasonable, right? That you're actually going to get people to take advantage of. I always my favorite is right sizing, right? Right sizing it seems simple, and obvious, right, when you're looking at a tool. But boy, those are some tough conversations sometimes with engineers to get them to agree to do it. And sometimes they just won't. So when I made my business case for a FinOps program, I just threw out all the right sizing stuff. I didn't even include that in my business case. I'm like, okay, that's not going to be possible. And then I kind of built a model around, okay, here is the best and the worst case scenario, right? So if our savings opportunity total is $1 million, maybe the worst case scenario is we only get 25% of that, right? And then the best case is we get 75%. And using that, that's kind of the envelope that we can work in of potential savings. And that is kind of where we would look to, okay, well, that's kind of like what our budget is, right? So if we're going to save, $500,000 over the course of a year, we've got a budget of less than that to fund the program and make it happen. And that's the cost of any tooling that you're going to bring in, the cost of any staff you're going to bring in. And so that's where we built our case. Is like, okay, we want to bring in this tool, and it's going to cost X dollars. We want to hire a person to kind of run the program on a day-to-day basis. That's going to cost us this much. And then you build that model of like, okay, well, we're going to spend this much over 12 months, and this is the savings we're going to get in return. So we're actually going to come out net positive at the end.
And that's actually a perfect example of how you translate things to the business. So thank you for sharing this example. Yeah. And let's go back, and you already talked about it. Engagement with engineers. You already mentioned the challenges of communicating with engineers and driving them to take action, which is a huge challenge. And I want to ask you, what do you think is the biggest mistake that FinOps practitioners make when they engage with engineers?
I mean, there could be a lot of them, but I think the biggest one is not building that relationship, right? So before we ever launched any kind of FinOps activities at Dolby, I was already in my role, I was already meeting with all these engineers on a regular basis to kind of understand what they're, what services are you using? What is your application that you built? What's the use case for it? What are your challenges? How can we help you from a technical perspective? So I had already built all those relationships and was doing it on a regular basis before we ever started talking about FinOps. And so there was a trust, right, between us, right, that they knew that I understood what they were doing. And so I wasn't just coming in cold and saying, "Hey, you need to turn that off, right? You need to start saving money. You're wasting money." So if you come in with kind of guns blazing, that's your opening, you're probably going to run into a fair amount of resistance versus if you have that relationship established, and you get a chance to know them, both technically and personally, quite frankly, so that they know who you are. That's going to lead to that trust and more success as you go forward with your FinOps efforts. So once we had that established, it was kind of easy to say, hey, and now let's start talking about how you could optimize your environment from a savings perspective, right? And we've got some tooling to help you, and let's talk about these savings opportunities. And again, figure out what's realistic and what's not, right? If you just kind of throw savings opportunities over the wall at them, that's a recipe for failure, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And would you say that high EQ is something you really need as a FinOps practitioner to be successful?
Uh, EQ, you mean like emotional?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not just a FinOps thing, right? That's a personal or career success thing, is being able to have those relationships, right? You need to have that ability in order to be successful in anything you do, including FinOps, for sure.
So I also want to ask you about the cultural aspect of that. Do you feel that it's the FinOps role to lead for a cultural change within the engineers, so they will care about a lot more about cost, they will take action a lot faster, etc.?
I do think that's important. I think this is something that gets talked about a lot these days in the FinOps community. And if you watched Werner Vogel's keynote from last year's reInvent, he talked about that a lot, right? This idea of cost is just another engineering decision, right? It's part of your design is thinking about optimizing for cost. So I think the more that you can build that into your engineering culture, the more successful you're going to be in your FinOps practice. I do think, though, that it also has to do with um, kind of management priorities. Like, so my personal experience at Dolby was I've been talking to people for years about saving money and like, hey, you need to go, you should think about doing a savings plan, or you should think about doing this optimization. And it's, oh yeah, we're too busy. We're just trying to build right now. But when the economy changed, and kind of 2022, 2023 timeframe, suddenly people were coming back to me and they're like, oh, hey, remember that thing we were talking about 2 years ago and I blew you off? Now I want to talk about it now, right? So it's, yes, building that culture is important, but it's also kind of a top-down thing as well from the company, right? And I think that's frankly where a lot of FinOps starts is, the CFO looks at the cloud bill and he's like, freaks out and like, what are we going to do to solve this problem? So it's kind of a combination. I also feel like I've been kind of saying this for a while. I do feel that one of the areas that maybe will drive engineers more is this kind of sustainability angle, right? Because at the end of the day, they're spending somebody else's money, right? It's not my money that I'm taking out of my wallet and using to pay for the AWS bill. It's the company's money. And so that's not going to be something that is every engineer is going to care about, but they do care about, hopefully, saving the planet for their kids, right? Most of us have kids and we want a better future for them. So, um, building efficiently in the cloud has a sustainability angle, right? It's more efficient is also going to usually be more cost effective and is going to be better for the environment. So I think that is something that's going to continue to be a growing theme when the FinOps community is the sustainability angle.
Interesting. And you obviously have a global engineering organization across the globe. Do you see a difference between different geographies with regards to how much they care about sustainability and how much it would drive them to actually do something about their cloud infrastructure?
I don't know that I've seen a real regional difference in that respect. I feel like it's pretty similar across the board, at least in our company, where it's something that we're concerned about. And as a kind of a FinOps team or as a cloud governance team, we have been kind of steering people to like, let's operate only in regions that are green, right? The more efficient regions. Let's try to focus on only building things there and not only building in other regions that are less green if there's a strong business case for doing it, right? So that's something we kind of have been doing since the get-go, is kind of focusing on building in, at least allegedly greener regions, or, renewable energy regions.
Very interesting. I have to tell, this is the first time I hear about the sustainability angle as something you can use to encourage and motivate engineers. That's actually a very interesting angle that I think organizations should definitely, to the very least, test. Okay, because it sounds very, very interesting. Cool. And let's get to the tougher parts. So, what are your key challenges today when it comes to FinOps?
I've seen in the FinOps survey that this is becoming less of a thing, but I still think within our company, getting engineers to actually take action is still a challenge for us, right? In the sense of like, they do have other priorities. And so getting them, we talked about it already, getting it to be kind of part of their engineering mindset to how to engineer for cost is still a challenge for us. So when I was talking about it before, it's a very kind of like aspirational, we want to do this, we want to build this more. We're definitely not there yet. That to me is definitely a challenge. And I think maybe the other one is making sure finance understands cloud, right? And I think we've made a lot of good strides in this area. Like, we actually, within our finance team, we have people who have cloud in their title now, right? They're responsible for kind of the cloud spend side of things. And that's totally new in the last couple of years, that there wasn't anybody doing that. But it was a long kind of uphill slog to get people to understand how cloud works, what are the fundamentals of cloud billing, because like I said before, it's just kind of totally different than the traditional IT procurement process, and it's very variable, right? And so that freaks finance people out usually.
Absolutely. I come from a finance home. My dad is a CFO. My mom is an economist. So I totally understand what you're talking about. And let's talk about this challenge of driving action from engineers. So you mentioned going top down, which is, I think, is an amazing tip. You mentioned harnessing sustainability. Is there anything else that you do from a bottom up perspective?
Well, I'd say this is not something we're doing yet, but I do think ultimately, and this is not my idea. I think I picked this up from a FinOps conference a couple of years ago. But this notion of you need to get the FinOps opportunities in the place where the engineer is working, right? So, getting those, getting an engineer typically is focused on their Jira tickets, right? Whatever they have in their pile to burn down, that's what they're going to be focused on, and that's what they're measured on. So if you can get those savings opportunities in their workflow where they're working, I think you ultimately are going to have more success. So, creating Jira tickets for those optimization opportunities is where we want to be going in the future, so that the engineer isn't having to kind of, context shift into some other space to figure out what they need to work on. And also helps with prioritization, right? Because if it's in the list with all the other enhancements they have on their list, they can, when they're doing their, stand-ups or whatever to figure out what they're going to work on next, that will be right there on the list and hopefully be given some priority.
And another angle that I'm thinking about lately, and I'm curious to hear your opinion, holding engineers accountable to a certain budget. Is that something that you do today? And in what level? Like, should the engineer know what is his budget? Is the team leader? Is the group leader? Like, what level should be held accountable for budget?
I mean, I think that is an interesting idea. It's definitely not something we're doing, because our cloud environment is kind of decentralized, right? So in the sense that each team kind of has their own account that they're paying for with their own cost center, and so we're just kind of handling the allocation function. We're not responsible for holding them to any kind of a budget. I'm sure there is a budget somewhere in there, right? But I don't necessarily feel like they always have visibility into what that budget is. Um, I do think that is something that could be useful in the future. I think the budgeting tools that are available in the cloud platforms are pretty limited. Like most of my experiences with AWS budgets, and we do use AWS budgets as kind of like a yardstick, right? So people are kind of aware of what their spending is, but it's not super useful in the sense of controlling spending, because it's kind of like an all or nothing thing. If you go over your budget and the only option that you have with AWS budgets is, okay, when you go over budget, I'm going to deploy an IAM policy that basically prevents anybody from doing anything, right? Which is, that would go over like a lead balloon here at Dolby. So that's not something we've ever even considered using. So yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, and hopefully things will become more mature from a tooling perspective to allow it to happen, but we're not there yet, at least in our practice.
Totally understood. And we talked a lot about the past. Mike, let's talk a bit about the future. Where do you see this industry of FinOps evolving from technology's perspective, from personas and responsibilities perspective as well?
I think I feel like we're still kind of in the early days of adoption of FinOps. I mean, I know that it's been around kind of formally now for 4 or 5 years. We had I think it was the third FinOps X conference just last July. So I do feel like we're still kind of in early days as far as the maturity of the practice. Um, I think that from a tooling perspective, what I've been observing is, there were kind of what I like to call the Gen 1 FinOps tooling, right? Which was basically like dashboards, right? Dashboards and, reporting, and maybe a little bit of like light optimization recommendations, like, oh, you should buy this savings plan, or you should do this right sizing, which we know how much I love right sizing. And what I observed in the last year is kind of this, what I'm calling Gen 2 FinOps tools, right? Which are, they're kind of moving beyond just the basic dashboarding capabilities, largely because the cloud providers themselves, their dashboards have gotten so much better that the need to pay for a third party to give you a dashboard is kind of rapidly declining. That's kind of actually Dolby's FinOps journey, as we went from paying for a third party tool for dashboarding to building it ourselves in house. And then, starting to look at what are the next generation of tools that might help us with our FinOps journey. So these tools are doing more kind of, finding the harder to find savings opportunities and making them visible, using some intelligence to understand, who launched a particular workload and making sure that it's kind of correlated with them. So it makes it easier for the FinOps practitioner to understand, who does this savings opportunity belong to. And I'm sure we're going to see, a lot more. I hate to use the term AI, but there's going to be some AI sprinkled in there along the way that will make some of these next generation tools more interesting. So from a tool perspective, I think that's where we're headed. You hear the FinOps Foundation talk a lot these days about like FinOps for other things besides cloud, right? So they talk about like SaaS or on-prem. I haven't seen that in my world, right? The management of SaaS is kind of is the responsibility of our procurement team, and it's not really something that IT, the FinOps side of things, has been asked to get involved in. That might change. But at least in our environment, I haven't seen that. But I do think there's a lot of talk about that, right? Like, okay, how can we apply FinOps principles to things beyond cloud? And maybe I'm talking too much about this particular question, but I think what I've noticed is that, there's kind of the industry leaders, right? If like you go to these Gartner conferences and you hear about people who are doing all these fantastic things, but when you get into the trenches and actually talk to other practitioners, none of us are there yet. Right. We're all still kind of crawling or walking. We're not at the run phase. You always have these, beautiful examples of companies that are in the run phase and they're doing all these wonderful things. But I think most of us are not there. Right. And so we need to be realistic about where we are and what our capabilities are as each individual organization, and build a plan that works for us versus trying to chase what the runners are doing.
Absolutely. And I'm telling you, it always looks a lot better in conferences on stage
Yes.
than how it is in the reality.
Yes, exactly.
But that's also something you always need to remember.
Yeah. And don't be discouraged by that, right? I mean, if you're like, my example is we didn't have a FinOps program at all for like the first 2 or 3 years. It was just me kind of doing FinOps on the side when I could, right? And it was only in the last year that I was able to finally actually make that business case to get a formal program in place. And even then, I've been dealing with a lot of like, well, are we really going to need to keep doing this after a year? Like, what if we go and we find all the savings opportunities and remediate them all, and then we'll be done, right? We'll be job done. FinOps is over. It's like, no, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that's how it's going to actually happen. If it does, great, right? But let's just kind of take a wait and see approach, because I think it's going to end up being a little bit different than you're expecting. And that kind of goes back to the kind of communicating expectations with your executives, right? It's like, if they think that, that's fine, right? But like I said at the beginning of the call, there's the universe of possible savings, and there's what's achievable, and there's also what's achievable in any given 12-month time frame that you have to think about.
Yeah, and I love your practical approach, Mike. Like, always be practical. What is achievable? When you look at these sessions on stage where, hey, we're automating everything and engineers jumping on doing everything that needs to be done, understand that the reality is a bit different, and don't be down because of that. I think it is a very important message for all our listeners.
Yeah, I think get started, right? And you like you said, you look at these people and they have these huge FinOps teams. Well, they probably also have a much larger cloud bill than you, right? That's probably why they have a huge FinOps team. The size of the team, I think, is directly related to how much you're spending. But even if you're a small organization and you don't have a team and it's just you doing FinOps on the side, you can still chip away at it and find those savings opportunities and get some wins.
Great. And because you mentioned the AI and it's 2025, so we have to talk about AI. Is Dolby concerned about AI costs?
I mean, I think we are in the sense that we're very cautious about what we're going to do on cloud compute when it comes to AI. So Dolby isn't really like, we're actually more focused on ML, right? We're not necessarily building generative AI applications for our customers. We're more looking at ML as a research tool, right? And as a development tool. And at least in my environment, there's a perception that doing that type of work on the cloud can be quite expensive, right? Because of the cost of the machines. And so we're being very cautious about what we're putting in the cloud in this regard, and looking at the cloud as more of a bursting opportunity, right? So if we have a certain amount of on-prem capacity, and if we need to go above that, then that's when we're going to be leveraging cloud and kind of building our ML workflow around this idea of that, we can deploy this ML job on-prem or in the cloud, depending on what the business requirements are, right? Like maybe we don't need it done right away, and so we can put it in a queue and wait for available on-premise capacity, or this is urgent, we need to do this right away, and we don't have any available capacity on-prem, so it has to go to the cloud. And making it possible to easily move those workloads back and forth is what we've been focused on over the past year.
And would you say that because it's an emerging technology and there are still a lot of testing being done, you should have less focus on that from a FinOps perspective, or quite the opposite? Hey, it's now beginning. Let's make sure we have FinOps out of the gate. So as we grow, we know we're good to go.
I think with these types of workloads, it is really important to be thinking about cost right off the bat, in the sense that because it can get so expensive so quickly, right? Making sure that you're trying to architect things so that you can be as efficient as possible with your usage of cloud resources is really important. I'm always pushing Spot, right, for these types of workloads, and I always get pushback on it, like, oh, well, we don't want to lose, all that training, all that learning that we did if this instance gets interrupted, so we can't do Spot. And I'm always pushing them to say, okay, well, you need to architect your job in a way that so that it can be resilient against those Spot interruptions, right? You need to do checkpointing, or I'm not a data engineer, not an ML scientist, so I don't know exactly how to achieve it, but I do know that it can be done because other companies are doing it. So making sure that you're building that environment in a way that you can be taking advantage of the savings opportunities that are there is really important.
Great. So, Mike, we talked a lot about FinOps. Let's talk a bit about Mike Graff. So, you live in the Bay Area today in Sunnyvale, right? You're almost 25 years in Dolby already, correct?
Yes, this May will be my 25th year at one company, which is kind of mind blowing when I think about it, right? It's definitely not normal in the Bay Area for most people, but I've been very blessed to be able to make my career here.
Absolutely. And the fact that you're, finding new initiatives all the time is amazing. Like you just built up your FinOps program and you're keep on building programs. That's awesome and amazing. And you mentioned that you also have a BA in English from Princeton University. Now, if I'm taking you now to the day you finish your BA in English in Princeton, take you to Mike Graff the days, what advice would you give this Mike Graff?
Oh, interesting question. I mean, when I graduated college, I thought I was going to be an English professor, right? That was I thought what my career path was going to be, and my specialty was medieval literature, right? So we're talking about like Chaucer, right? And what I realized very quickly after graduating college is that there are not a lot of jobs in this field, right? It's not like there's hundreds of thousands of medieval English professors out there. And there's already been like 500 years of scholarship done in this field. And so I was like, I'm not sure that I'm going to be happy doing this. And I kind of bounced into IT kind of sideways, right? I am not formally trained in IT, but I've always been into computers since the early days, and that's just kind of how I ended up over the course of my career. So I guess the advice I would give would be open to whatever opportunities come to you, right? And be flexible about the path. Um, as well as, you make your own path. Like my experience at Dolby has been no one's ever given me like, okay, well, you've been here for so X years, so we're going to give you this promotion. It's never worked that way. It's more about um, defining the role that you want and kind of figuring out how to get there, right? And that comes from your own personal initiative as well as having very supportive managers, which I've had over my time here that have enabled that career development.
That is actually an excellent advice. And let's talk a bit what you do outside of work. Any hobbies?
Yeah, I mean, so I do have 3 boys, and they're teenagers now, but, they've been involved in scouting, for years, and so I've been volunteering with scouting, here in the US for many, many years, so that I'm pretty passionate about that program, helping to develop a kind of whole person that has, you know, has kind of survival skills and outdoor skills and a love of the environment and love of nature and being outdoors as much as possible, which I think is so important now with our digital culture. You go on these trips with these scouts and they're just like any other teenager, right? When they're here in the Bay Area, they've got their phone out, they're playing Brawl Stars, right? But you get them on these outings and you get them out in the wilderness and you take their phones away and suddenly they're like, real human beings, right? And they're having fun and they're playing games and they're singing songs and, just being actual humans, which I think is a really valuable thing for kids to have. And developing those leadership skills as well. I know I talked about communication skills. Um, Scouting does a really good job of teaching those as well because these kids are forced to talk to adults, right? They have to be able to communicate effectively with park rangers and people in the community to be able to complete their programs. So that's been really great. I'm big into music. So playing music, listening to music. I was a DJ in college, jazz DJ. So I've been into music for forever, and that's actually pretty common at Dolby. Almost everybody at Dolby that I know is a musician or into music, right? It's just part of the culture of the company. Um, and then I think that I'm also extremely serious about coffee.
Yep, yep.
So I'm big into espresso and trying out different beans from different roasters and just having fun with that hobby. I'm pretty passionate about that, and we could probably do a whole nother 45-minute podcast on coffee if this wasn't the FinOps podcast. So that's a big thing for me. So yeah, so family life, getting outdoors, enjoying music and entertainment, obviously movies and science fiction. I think you have to be a science fiction geek if you're in the IT field. Most people are. So yeah.
No, sounds like you're very busy and you do a lot of cool stuff. It's actually inspiration for me to do a lot more things outside of work. So thank you for that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and that's probably one of the reasons why I've been able to stay at the company I'm at for so long is I actually have been able to have a life outside of work, right? If I was, if I was at a startup or something like that where I was having to work, ridiculous hours, I probably wouldn't have stayed. But where I work, having a life is important, right? It's expected to be beyond, being a full person and not just a drone.
Absolutely. And Mike, if people want to reach out to you to ask you questions, what is the best way to reach out?
So you can find me on LinkedIn, right? I also have my own blog, which is called Cloudy Advice. So that's cloudyadvice.com is my blog. And I write articles there about FinOps topics as well as kind of cloud governance topics in general. So you can find me there. So either go to my blog or check me out on LinkedIn. It'd be the best way to find me.
Sound good. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
I had a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
For sure. And I would like to thank our audience for joining us today. If you learned something or laughed, tell someone about this podcast. Mike, thank you again. This has been another exciting episode of FinOps in Action. See you next time. That wraps up another episode of FinOps in Action. Thank you for joining. For show notes and more, please visit finopsinaction.com. This show is brought to you by Point 5, empowering teams to optimize cloud costs with deep detection and remediation tools that drive action.